With the strains of the WSU Brass Choir, we bring you another Mosaic program from the campus of Washington State University. Here is your host on Mosaic, Hugh Rundell.
Welcome to another edition of Mosaic from the Washington State University campus. Our guest on Mosaic today is Mrs. Mary Avery, former archivist with the WSU Library, who has an interesting slice of Washington history for us. Today's jets look like this, but not too many years ago, the airplane looked like this one, shown in the Pangborn collection in the archives section of the Washington State University Library. It's obvious that these papers present a fairly detailed summary of American aviation history up through World War II. How did this all come about, Mrs. Avery?
They are the photographs, newspaper clippings, and correspondence accumulated by Clyde Pangborn, for whom the Wenatchee airfield was named. Fortunately, his mother, Opal Pangborn of Wenatchee, and his brother, P.C. Pangborn of Seattle and Leavenworth, saved these after Clyde's death and presented them to the WSU Library through the Friends of the Library. Clyde Pangborn, a noted early aviator, became world famous in 1931 when he and Hugh Rundell made the first nonstop flight across the Pacific, landing at Wenatchee.
I presume then that he was a Pacific Northwesterner?
Yes. Mr. Pangborn was born in Bridgeport, Washington in 1893 and moved to St. Mary's, Idaho when he was in high school. He graduated as a civil engineer from the University of Idaho in 1915 and practiced engineering until he enlisted in the aviation section of the Signal Corps in 1917. For the remainder of World War I, he taught flying at Ellington Field in Houston, Texas. By this time, he had become so devoted to flying as a career that he hired out to the young Northwest Aircraft Corporation of Spokane to do exhibition flying in Washington and Idaho, and in 1920, he and Ivan R. Gates formed the Gates Flying Circus.
What was a flying circus?
It was a kind of circus in the air. The company operated several planes that made one-night stands from one town to another or stayed for a longer period in connection with a county fair. These pictures show Pangborn and Gates with some of the machines that they used. Clyde acted as manager for the company and as its chief pilot. The firm kept from 3 to 6 planes in operation, and in addition to performing stunts, they took crowds up at their various stops. The pilots would take people up for short airplane rides. During all of these, he did not injure a single passenger. In his only serious accident, he was alone in his plane when it caught fire at 4,000 feet. He had a parachute, but he brought the flaming plane down, pulled his camera from the forward cockpit, and snapped pictures while it burned. On another occasion in Houston, Texas in 1924, a girl parachute jumper who leaped from his plane was caught in the rope and dangled 20 feet below the plane so that it could not land. Pangborn turned over the controls to his mechanic, crawled out on the wing, and pulled the girl back into the plane. In later years, Clyde reminisced about his passengers in the flying circus in the following words. Would you please read his statement, Mr. Rundell?
Most of them were taking their first airplane ride. They were flying in planes that wouldn't be allowed to leave the ground today. They held their breath through loops, rolls, spins, and other stunts. The same procedure with passengers would result in a jail sentence for the pilot today. We stunted for a number of reasons. It was good psychology, although we didn't call it by that name then. We knew it drew crowds to the field. But the stunting did more than that. The ship that could stand it had to be good. The man who flew it had to be good too. When the history of aviation is written, if there is any place in it for me, I would prefer to be known as the pilot who barnstormed continuously for 11 years in every state in the Union and who carried 150,000 passengers safely during those days. That means something. It represents flying, and flying no matter how much we may regret it, is slowly becoming a lost art.
He meant this in the sense that much of the aviator's function was being appropriated by mechanical devices in the later types of airplanes.
Pangborn continues, the open cockpits have been replaced by cabins, which are the last word in comfort and elegance. Lighted and improved airports have replaced the farmers' fields from which we operated. Incidentally, it was our operating from farmers' fields that won us the name of Barnstormers. Outwardly, it's a far cry to the days when our ticket sellers stood in the field and enthused the crowd with high or low, fast or slow, any way you want to go. Fly with the birds. See the world from the air with the world's master stunt pilots.
In 1931, when Clyde made his famous trans-Pacific flight, planes were still anything but luxurious, so that his feat required greater physical endurance and skill. Lindbergh's crossing of the Atlantic in 1927 had, of course, centered the public attention in the United States on long flights of this kind, and a number of aviators were beginning to contemplate similar feats.
The Graf Zeppelin, as I remember, had set a record of 21 days in 1929 for such a flight, had it not?
Yes, this was the next hurdle, and by chance, Clyde became associated with Hugh Rundell in the next attempt. Rundell, who is the one on the right in your screen, was a wealthy young New Yorker who had met Clyde on one of his barnstorming tours in the late 1920s. And he became so enamored of flying that he joined Clyde in his flying circus. Morris Markey, in an article written for the New Yorker magazine for March 21, 1931, says, "In dull little hotels, they gasped about the chances for getting around the world fast in an airplane, and one night Herndon wrote out a check for $100,000. He made it payable to the Around the World Corporation and elected himself president. The two men got Louis Yancey to teach navigation to Herndon, who at that time knew none at all. They took a suite in the Roosevelt Hotel, and for 6 months they accumulated maps, and Herndon spent 8 hours a day learning to be a navigator. They chose a single-engine Belenka, which could go a maximum of 6,000 miles without refueling." Mr. Rundell, would you please read Mr. Markey's statement about their attitude at the end of their training?
Pang can fly through anything, Herndon says, if I can only keep him on the course. Sitting in this hotel room, gossiping with these fellows who presently will be off trying to fly around the world in the space of a week, it's difficult indeed to catch the flush of romance that the enterprise implies. Perhaps this is because of the complete, unostentatious confidence that fills the rich boy and the old barnstormer. Fitzmaurice said, "Really, I think you've got a pretty good chance to make it. It's a tough one, of course, but you're going about it right." Pangborn nodded absently, "Oh, sure, we'll make it all right." The original plan had been to follow the line of the Siberian Peninsula, the Bering Straits, the Aleutian Islands, and avoid the 5,000-mile flight across the Pacific. But one day Yancey said, "Maybe you ought to come straight across the drink. The engine can do it." Pangborn was reading the newspaper. "Which is the quickest?" he asked. "Straight over the water, of course," Yancey replied. "Well, then we'll come straight across," said Pangborn, and he kept on reading. I'm quite sure that it has never really occurred to them, Pangborn or Herndon, that they might be forced down. Their only concern is to make genuine speed.
From March 28, 1931, all of the major papers in the country carried pictures of the men and feature articles about their attempt. Every day, 4 other groups had had publicity on their proposed attempts for long-distance flights that spring, but Pangborn and Herndon had kept their plans secret until their plane was delivered. They used the name Miss Vidal. Before they were ready to take off, Wiley Post and Harold Gatty succeeded in flying round the world in the Winnie Mae in 8 days and approximately 16 hours. They reached New York on July 2nd, and this event changed the situation materially for Pangborn and Herndon. Now, instead of having to try to beat the Graf Zeppelin's record of 21 days, they were faced with the proposition that they had less than 9 days. They intended to pit cruising range against speed because their Belanca was much slower than the post-Lockheed Vega, but it could stay aloft for a much longer time.
A newspaper report said, Herndon and Pangborn expect to make only 5 refueling stops of not more than 2 hours each. We have eliminated the Harbor Grace stop, said Pangborn, and will fly direct to Moscow. Then we will fly to Irkutsk, Khabarovsk, Nome, Chicago, and New York. The Belanca will permit Herndon and Pangborn to alternate at the controls, a distinct advantage over the Winnie Mae, which was flown the entire distance by post.
On July 17, 1931, 1,000 people were on hand to watch Pangborn and Herndon take off for Moscow. The New York Sun for that day said, burdened with a load of 830 gallons of gasoline, their big Belanca plane failed to rise after a run of nearly a mile and missed the gully in which Rene Fonck crashed 4 years ago by the breadth of a mosquito's eyebrow, as one witness described it. Herndon, sensing disaster, pulled dump valves and managed to release 375 gallons of fuel. This, according to the New York World Telegram, flooded the field with gasoline. The big plane skimmed a hangar and just cleared high-tension wires. It circled and then landed safely. They then decided that they would have to limit their supply of gasoline to 700 gallons. And if that wouldn't get them to Moscow, they would then come down in Berlin or London to refuel.
On July 28th at 6:20 a.m. they tried again, also with a full load of 830 gallons of gasoline, and got aloft without difficulty. On July 29th, newspaper accounts were speculating as to where they were. Somebody in Valentia, Ireland, thought he heard a plane go over, which would probably have been theirs. With present radio communications a universal feature of flying, this hearsay means of locating a plane in flight seems absurd today. The first definite word came from them on July 30th, when they were forced down by fog and landed in a field on a steep hillside near Cardigan, Wales. They were sadly disappointed by this change of plan because they still had sufficient gasoline for 8 more hours flying. They had circled over Ireland for 4 hours, trying to find a rift in the fog, then turned south and landed on the first open ground they saw. The following day, they flew without difficulty from Croydon Airfield in London to Berlin. At that time, they were 20 hours and 38 minutes behind the time of Post and Getty. The batteries running their navigation lights were out, but they refused to wait for mechanics to fix them. All they had were substitute batteries that lighted their instrument panel. They reached Moscow on July 31st, spent 5 hours there, and took off for Irkutsk in Siberia. They were forced down twice by bad weather in Siberia, and in addition, a damaged wing caused another delay. Before they reached Japan, they realized that they had no chance of beating the post-Getty record. As usual, however, they did not let this bitter disappointment alter their plans any more than was absolutely necessary. And in Tokyo, they began to consider alternatives.
It happened that an Osaka newspaper, the Asahi Shimbun, had offered a $25,000 prize to the first airman to fly from Japan directly across the Pacific to the United States. And the Seattle Chamber of Commerce matched this with an offer of an additional $25,000. The fact that this was much more difficult than their planned island hopping to Nome, Alaska, was no deterrent to Pangborn and Herndon, of course, and they decided before they left Siberia to try for the prize money. Since they had no maps of Japan, they wired an English-language newspaper in Japan, the Japan Times, asking if its staff would telegraph them in Khabarovsk the location of the Tokyo airfield. The newspaper owner got in touch with the American Embassy, which assured him that its staff would apply for a landing permit for them from the Japanese Government Aviation Bureau. The flyers then took off from Siberia, believing that everything was arranged for their arrival in Tokyo. However, it proved not to be that simple.
When their bags were opened upon their arrival at the Tokyo airfield on August 6th, a camera was discovered with exposed film. Officials retained the camera, had the film developed, and discovered that it contained pictures of the Hokkaido military fortifications and other secret installations, absolutely closed to photographers or even to visitors. The officers had been suspicious of Pangborn and his companion, and were debating whether or not they should send planes to tell them they could not land in Japan, when they appeared without warning and without permission to visit Japan. The photographs settled the matter in the minds of the police. These men were spies. The police put them under house arrest and seized their plane. Fortunately, an influential newspaper, the Osaki Mainichi, championed their cause and expressed its intention of backing their trans-Pacific flight. And the civilian officials in the communications department got into an argument with the military officers over these flyers. The latter wanted to make an example of them, whereas the former wanted to take advantage of the publicity for Japan of the planned Pacific crossing. Pangborn and Herndon, therefore, waited as patiently as they could for the Japanese authorities to make up their minds. Some jingoistic societies, including the Black Dragons, tried to rouse the Japanese public against the flyers as tools of the United States government. The Lindberghs were also ready to fly to Japan, and it looked as if they too might be suspect. The people were evidently too much interested in the increased air traffic to be stampeded into hysteria, however, and by August 15th, the appropriate Japanese court released Pangborn and Herndon with a fine of $1,025 each.
On October 4th, they were finally permitted to leave Japan on their attempt to fly the Pacific. 23 hours later, a Navy radio station on St. Paul Island in the Bering Sea sent a message to its counterpart in Bremerton, Washington, that a plane had been heard passing over the Aleutians. Because of very heavy fog, the observers did not see the plane. Because their speed would normally increase as their gasoline load was used up, it was estimated that they would fly over Seattle around 6 o'clock the following morning. When Pangborn's mother was interviewed in Wenatchee, she said that she believed her boys would not bother to land in Wenatchee, but would go on to New York to try to set a new nonstop flight record. As it turned out, they found that they had far too much weight to maintain necessary speed and altitude. So they threw off their landing gear completely. Then ice on their wings almost brought them down. Their single engine stopped running at one point when the gasoline unexpectedly ran out, and they were dangerously low before they could get an extra gas tank hooked up. They thought that their calculations were off and were afraid that they were heading out over the open ocean when they finally spotted land along Queen Charlotte's Island and later saw the glow of Seattle and circled Mount Rainier in the storm 3 times before they could get their bearings to continue east. They were convinced that it was too foggy to go on to Salt Lake and decided to put down in Wenatchee, but they had no way of telling people of their intention.
In Wenatchee, on the evening of October 4th, Pacific Coast time, people started going to the flying field on the chance they would land there, and a crowd of several hundred waited into the night. Finally, most of them gave up and went home. But Clyde's mother, his brother Percy, Kirby Billingsley, a reporter from the Wenatchee World, and other friends waited throughout the night. Fortunately for us, another person waited with them, a newsreel photographer who took the films we'll see in a moment. It was at about 7 o'clock in the morning, the next day, October 5th, 1931, that the cry went up, "Here they come." The first thing people noticed was that the landing gear was gone and that Pangborn was circling the field, dumping excess gasoline, obviously for a belly landing. By the time they actually landed, a good crowd had gathered again. Among the first to greet the flyers was Mrs. Pangborn, Clyde's mother. And somewhere in all the excitement, a man from the Japanese newspaper, Asahi, presented Pangborn and Herndon a check for $25,000. This is the original soundtrack on the newsreel film.
Wenatchee declares a holiday to see Pangborn and Herndon slide to home base. Everybody dropped everything and made a beeline for the airport. The landing gear was dropped in the ocean to increase speed and conserve the fuel, but the boys made a pretty good landing at that.
After the initial excitement of the landing had died away, there was still a great outpouring of pride and affection for these two flyers, and parades in Seattle, New York, and many other places in the country. This is the Seattle Parade.
The difficulties in supplying the press with a report of the landing were told in the October 10th issue of Editor and Publisher. There was only one telephone line, and representatives of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, the Seattle Times, the Wenatchee World, and United Press all wanted to use it, when, after an all-night vigil, the shout went up, "Here they come." The reporters compromised. Carl Cleveland of the Wenatchee World did the telephoning. In full view of the field, he described the landing over the wire to Laureen Burks, society editor of the World. Miss Burks repeated his words as they were received, and Kirby Billingsley, city editor, repeated them to the Associated Press office in Seattle over a rough connection. William Green, a reporter, also repeated Cleveland's words to the Post-Intelligencer, the Times, and the UP one at a time, over the only other available telephone line out of the World office. From Seattle, the story was flashed to San Francisco and then on to New York and throughout the country. Mr. Billingsley late that afternoon got in touch with the flyers and obtained an interview with them, evidently with their permission. It was sent out over the AP wires as their own story. The story was credited by the AP to the Seattle Times. Another amazing tidbit of information concerning this flight is that 2 years later, in Ripley's Believe It or Not column, the item appeared that one of the wheels dropped to lighten the load had drifted 4,400 miles and was found less than 200 miles from Wenatchee.
After this epic-making flight, Clyde Pangborn continued to win aviation prizes. He took second place at the International World Air Race from London to Melbourne, Australia in 1934. He opened the first night air express from New York to Los Angeles. And he was the only foreigner ever rated as a test pilot in England. At the beginning of World War II, he recruited pilots and helped organize the RAF Ferry Command, and he made 185 air crossings of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Indian Oceans as senior captain of the Ferry Command during the remainder of the war. Afterwards, he continued as an extremely successful commercial test pilot until his death in 1958 from the after effects of pneumonia. Mary, this exciting slice of Washington history we mentioned earlier in the program is all embodied in that Pangborn collection. I wish you could tell our viewers a little bit more about how we acquired the collection and about some of the things that are in it that we couldn't show on our program.
It was in 1960 when Mrs. Opal Pangborn, the mother of Clyde, who was then living in Spokane, decided to move back to Wenatchee, the family home. And she was faced with the question of what to do with this enormous collection of photographs and newspaper clippings and letters and so on. She decided to store it on the ranch of her other son, Mr. P.C. Pangborn, who has a beautiful ranch high up in the Cascades above Leavenworth, where he and the family spend the summers. And after the papers were deposited there, Mr. Pangborn learned of the program that the WSU Library has for locating any family papers that have any historical significance and persuading people either to deposit them in the WSU Library or some other reputable institution of their own choice. Mr. Pangborn wrote to ask if we would be interested in this collection, and of course we were most excited at the prospect of getting a first-hand and an extensive account of the development of aviation, both in the state of Washington and on the part of one of our famous native sons who had represented the entire Pacific Northwest, actually, in early aviation history. So members of the staff of WSU Archives went over to Mr. Pangborn's ranch and brought back the documents. Now, as to the types of things that are in the collection, I suppose the newspaper clippings probably represent the biggest segment. Clyde had evidently subscribed to a news clipping service, and he had thousands of newspaper clippings, really from the time of his flying circus days to the end of his life, about his own exploits and those of other aviators of the time. Then there are also thousands of photographs of all of his fellow aviators, of famous people who honored Clyde and the others, and photographs of the planes themselves, which aviation students today are very glad to have because they are here brought together in one body is this large collection, really, of the history of the development of the type of plane used. Then there are personal letters and the kind of mementos that people gather.
Well, it certainly sounds like a fascinating collection and must be unique even in that group of fascinating collections you have there in the archives. And I certainly want to thank you for showing it to us on Mosaic and being our guest and, as I said before, giving us this interesting slice of Washington history. Join us again for another edition of Mosaic from the campus of Washington State University in Pullman.
This has been Mosaic from the campus of Washington State University. Your host on Mosaic is Hugh Rundell. Today's program directed by Cal Watson. Mosaic is produced by the television services of Washington State University.